I'd like to call the joint Papillion City Council and Planning Commission Comprehensive Plan Review Meeting to order. Ms. Brown, would you please take the roll?
Sunday, Mumgarde, Gaines, Glover,
Here.
Jaworski,
Here.
Klug,
Here.
Stubbe,
Here.
Ingber,
Here.
Carson, Emsweiler,
Here.
Pope, Raybeck, Keller,
Here.
Masters, Robinson III,
Here.
Thompson, Wilson, Sotak.
We have a quorum of the council, but not of the Planning Commission?
Correct.
Okay. Would you join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? Pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. And a current copy of the Open Meetings Act is posted in the back of the conference room. And we got a presentation of the proposed comprehensive plan by HDR. And so just one quick announcement and then an introduction. Doug, do you want to give a quick announcement of the meetings for the next couple of days? These are not official agenda items, but I think it's appropriate as a presentation if you want to update us.
All right, so starting tomorrow, Tuesday through Thursday, we have a 3-day design workshop for the master planning effort for the northwest corner of Highway 370 and 84th Street. So Calabretto Construction and Colliers are leading that effort. We're actually going to be in the room next door. We've got a design team coming in, and we're going to be developing conceptual plans for that really critical site for Papillion. So we have pinup sessions tomorrow night, Wednesday night, and Thursday night from 5 to 7. So your attendance at those will be welcome. Basically, kind of the big picture is we pin ideas up to the board, we get your feedback and input, and based on that input, we make refinements the ensuing day. So as much as you guys can participate, we would love to have you there. At that time, or those 3 times do not work for you, you're free and welcome to stop by at any time during the course of the day, because we'll be in there working away. So we'd love to see you there.
And those are not official city meetings. The city's not sponsoring those. He's representing a private developer who wants to go through the master planning process. And a little bit unusual, we're being invited into the comprehensive planning. So wonderful opportunity for everybody to show up. Mr. Glover.
Tell me the corridor again.
It's the old Trumbo. It's the Trumbo parcel.
Oh, the Trumbo.
Is it the same session every day, or?
It's going to be, if I understand it, it's going to be like the way they do the charrette. So they'll take input one day. They'll then put their thoughts together. You can come in and see those, give feedback. The next day, they'll take all that feedback, work it again, present it again the second night, and then repeat that third. So it's iterative.
Can we get an email on that?
Yeah.
Telling us what the deal
Yeah.
with
So that's the next 3 nights.
So are you starting with some of your ideas, or is it a blank sheet when we walk in?
So the development team has some general ideas that they would like to see. Basically, they envision a pedestrian-oriented mixed-use neighborhood with a variety of different uses. They asked us to be as creative as we could be. So tomorrow we're going to start with 5 different designers. We're all going to spread out around the room and develop 5 different concepts. And then we'll pin those to the wall, and then we'll debate the pros and cons of each of those designs. So then the next day, we'll refine those maybe down to 2, maybe 1 concept at that point in time, taking the best of each. But the idea is that we're going to start really broad, and over the course of those 3 days, achieve a general consensus on a master plan. So they've asked the design team to, as I said before, be as creative as we can be, and let's see what sticks. But they really want to see something unique and special for Papillion, that's right size for Papillion, and has enduring and lasting value. We met Friday, and I think we heard charming and quaint and contextual, those words quite often. So I think it could end up really nice.
May I repeat those times again?
What times are they?
Pinups are 5 to 7 each night, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday.
5 to 7, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday of this week. So just so we're clear for the record, that was not a specific agenda item. It was a presentation, but I think it's directly in line with conversations regarding comprehensive plan. So I don't think it was off topic to talk about. So thank you for that. So I mentioned the current copy of the Open Meetings Act, so we are under the presentation of the proposed comprehensive plan. HDR is here to present. Mark will facilitate. The intent is an open discussion. There's been a lot of work being done on the comprehensive plan, and it's getting down to some of the final pieces to put the final draft together, and thought it was real important to get both planning commission and the city council together. It's an honor to have both together, because I think in 10 years we've probably only done that once or twice. And we've actually got another one we want to do, talking about housing types and affordable housing, that we'll be doing soon too. So hopefully we can be learning from each other and hearing each otother. Bit of background. This process, we're probably 6 months behind in the process. The city council had budgeted for a complete update of the comprehensive plan in the current budget year this budget year we had budgeted for a 100% update. And my hope was about 6 months ago, we actually would have been finishing it up. We had a contract in place with another firm, and I think we were thinking they were going to be about 80% done. And when we started reviewing some of the work, I'm going to guess they were maybe about 20% done. So we let that firm go, and they're not completing the work. They had kind of subcontracted, or we had subcontracted with HDR to play a bit of the role. And so HDR had already had some insight to what we wanted and what had been going on. And so we reached out to HDR and said, is there a way you could rally around this and help us get it wrapped up? And they were very gracious and said, yep, we had to reset some time frame to redo some work. But Mark and Travis from our staff, and then HDR have really been doing a lot of heavy lifting to bring it back together. So while it's delayed, I think we're going to end up with a better work product with HDR being the lead and being involved. So thank you very much for what you guys are doing. It's very much appreciated. So it's an open discussion, and so I'm going to turn it over to Mark and Doug, and I think you guys are going to lead the discussion. And it is an open discussion, so Planning Commission, City Council, full participation. Really want feedback. We got a couple of them float around if we need to.
Hello, Tess, you guys hear me okay? Thank you, Mayor. Hello, everybody. My name is Andy Gorham. I am the landscape architect and project manager from HDR. I've been working with Mark and Travis and company in detail on the comp plan update. You've heard from Doug Basson, our community planning urban design lead from HDR, so he's also a member of the team. And I think, as the mayor touched on, this is meant to be an open discussion. We have a lot of slides to get through. I'll be emphasizing on a few of them that are kind of points of emphasis, and kind of going through the other ones pretty quick here. But feel free to jump in with any questions when you have them as it pertains to the slides. And between the four of us, I think we should be able to answer most of them. So thank you again for attending. So with our comp plan update, really the mayor touched on it really nicely. We were brought on originally to update the comp plan, knowing that Papillion is changing, is growing, and I think from the city's perspective, the goal is to really kind of direct that growth in a concentrated, effective way for the community, so we're accomplishing all the goals that the community has, and the growth areas are planned out as to provide kind of the largest benefit for the city as a whole as we can. So basically, this title slide is kind of how the comp plan is broken up in terms of chapters. We really used the 2012 comp plan as kind of a basis, and so as I mentioned, you can see we have a full slate of chapters here. And so as I said, I'll kind of touch on major points of emphasis within the plan, and kind of buzz through a couple other sections, which will be a lot of material being pulled over from that 2012 plan. So to open the comp plan, we are looking at chapter 1, which is before you today, and really kind of a broad overview of the community as is at the time of adoption. And really, we're focused in on the basic demographics of the city. Currently, the city's population is just under 24,000 people. But if you kind of broaden the scope area there and to look at within the 2-mile ETJ of the community, there's an additional 16 to 18,000 potential future residents within that. As the chart shows there on the screen, it's what we like to call a kind of a bottom-heavy pyramid in terms of kind of age breakdown. As you can see, Papillion's fairly strong in terms of the younger populations within the community. And so that's really a good thing for the community as it kind of turns focus towards the future. And so again, that kind of reiterates the need for the city to kind of have a nice planning and development framework to kind of guide growth. From an economic standpoint, there are a number of factors that are really setting up to be really bonuses and benefits for that growth. Both in terms of employment and retail dollars, Papillion is set up as a net importer of those, so a really good job market, really good potential for job growth. And also in terms of retail and commercial activity, Papillion, as that last note touches on, is the only Suffolk County community that's an importer of retail dollars. So the framework for retail and commercial use is strong there. But I think as we'll touch on throughout the plan, the need for the right kind of retail that fits the market and fits the adjacent neighborhood is very important. No one within the community is going to want big box retail at every corner. So as you'll see with some later slides, a lot of our overall master plan work has been focused on directing the right land use for the right area of town. And again, the middle point there, income, 70% of households earns more than state median income. So it's a really strong market currently.
Could you go back to slide?
Sure.
The consumer expenditures. How do you make a determination as far as how much we're importing? Is that chamber information? Where does that come from?
Perhaps Mark, do you have background on
We gather that information from Suffolk County EDC.
Okay.
UNL did a study 3 years ago, I think, that looked at every single county in Nebraska, through the public policy group, and they did a lot of work around import and exportation, and it's fairly recent. I'm thinking that's maybe where it came from. And Papillion actually stood out as an anomaly in the state for how much we were importing.
Is that one-year data, or are you able to show a trend line continuing to go up, or do we know?
Why don't we take that as a note?
Okay, that'd be great.
Thanks. So as I touched on, then moving away from kind of the overview of Papillion, we want to touch on the development framework. So before we jump into kind of the land use plan and assigning uses on a physical map, we wanted to explain to the comp plan readers about the rationale that really led us to some of the decisions that shape that land use plan and land use policy. You know, what we pulled, section of what we pulled in from the 2012 plan is really continuing to focus on Papillion being a healthy community. You know, beyond kind of the basic environmental aspects of that healthy community, and also kind of along that bottom bullet point there around the individual, encouraging physical activity from an environmental standpoint, managing the natural resources, and also combining the two, bringing people out into nature and enjoying some of the open space amenities the city has here. Expanding upon that, we also wanted Papillion to remain economically healthy community in terms of you know, positive redevelopment and a careful analysis in terms of growth between the benefit and cost of a given development. And also take advantage of the city's many civic resources and civic facilities. Really draw attention to those and really maximize those in terms of use and the potential benefit for the city. So then how do we apply those kind of general overarching concepts in terms of how we shape a physical plan? And so I believe it was mentioned earlier, the goal would be, you know, in kind of concentrated areas, we want to practice kind of an urban development standard, and you kind of apply these urban form principles, as opposed to your kind of traditional suburban auto-centric uses that really don't provide maximum benefit for the community as a whole. So obviously there'd be an investment in utilities, infrastructure, and streets from the city's perspective, the preservation of open space and the natural areas. Really, in terms of the streets and infrastructure, really creating a real focus on connectivity throughout the city, emphasizing some of the transportation, multimodal options, again, moving away from a strictly auto-centric development pattern, emphasize pedestrian usage, potential for transit, in terms of tying into the regional network with Omaha and beyond. And really, the movement to get onto the streetscape, integrate kind of more human-scale design aspects, provide plenty of public space within our residential neighborhoods, and then also emphasize community and stakeholder outreach for various redevelopment projects. Future growth areas. So originally, as part of that original comp plan design team, our firm, HDR, was brought in to really focus on what we term kind of the future growth areas. And so these were the sites determined from the South Sarpy County water treatment plant study, looking at kind of those early phase one areas within Sarpy County that could see future residential and mixed-use growth, within the city's boundaries. And so we are brought in and wanted to create kind of a development framework for those areas, basically everything kind of in the south portion of the city, south of the Sarpy County ridge line. And so what we touched on in that process is we developed a plan for that regional area that was really built on this kind of layered system that was kind of really a McCarthyan analysis where each one of these individual layers built on each other, and that really informed the next and kind of the overall land use pattern for that portion of the city. The last few items I guess I'll touch on here, and I'll start with the existing land use pattern. And so obviously what really jumps out on this page is, as I mentioned, we're really focusing on the south portion of the city. So those large expanses of agricultural land, those green areas, the idea being is how can we assign new future land use to those that would actually be part of the community's larger vision to direct effective growth for the benefit of all users. We can't, the goal wasn't going to be to have all single-family estate lots spread out throughout the entire southern portion of the city. How can we add in some density and some potential mixed use there, uses within that area of town? So really, as a base map, major highways, study area, obviously we have I-80 cutting diagonally through the site there. Highway 50 and 144th Street is the main north-south black line there, and then we have Highway 370 moving east to west through the study area. The areas in orange there, it might be tough to see here in the room, but those were kind of the areas of focus that we were, those were the current development areas that were actually seeing redevelopment or actually had planned projects in the pipeline. So those were kind of outside our focal areas. The blue dash line there is that ridge line, prominent topographic feature that pretty much bisects the city from east to west. So as you can see there, the white outlined areas there really was our area of focus. A fairly large area that really had us hone in on a few areas of redevelopment. But the idea would be is how can we leverage as new growth happens south of that ridge line, how can we kind of direct growth in those areas? From an overall mobility standpoint, it was important for us to pull that arterial grid down, continue that from Papillion and also from Douglas County to the north there, continue that mile arterial network. But can we redesign some of these arterial streets to have more of kind of a green, more of a higher aesthetic component in their redesign there? So we showed options in terms of street configurations and potential landscaping and streetscaping design. One of the major mobility propositions we had in that planning process was the idea of could we create a kind of a secondary street, what we termed the Ridgeline Boulevard, that roughly followed that ridge line across the study area. What that was meant to provide more of a local, kind of more of a civically important type street that would hopefully bring traffic off the arterial network and help accommodate more local users moving between neighborhoods and between some of our development nodes within the pattern to kind of, again, diversify the transportation options. here again, it's kind of like a graphic for that. What did that look like? I know since the time we created these graphics, we've worked with Travis and company, and I know they've gotten some initial feedback from developers, and I think the understanding would be, as the graphics as shown, the provision of on-street parking throughout the Ridgeline Boulevard. I think if a certain development comes online and, due to some limiting factors in terms of topography or some existing utilities, the option would be is, perhaps we may not need all that on-street parking, but I think the preservation of those wide parkway strips with those double rows of street trees and the ornamental lighting would be preserved, so you still get a nice amenity corridor through the city, but we may not have a provision for parking throughout. And that seems, I think, is going to be beneficial for the developers as they look at project by project throughout the area.
I think the key here is to think of this as a grand civic spine. Your great cities have these key civic features to them. And that's really the idea behind this is you have this thing called the Ridgeline, and it's significant. So how can we turn that into a real opportunity? So it's this parallel parkway that traverses that. And as Andy stated really nicely, is you have this grid system. Well, there's times when you don't feel like taking the grid system, the arterial. So how can you get off of that and take this civic street and get all the way across the city and maybe have less traffic? It's similar to the parkways. You see the HWS Cleveland Parkway in West Omaha. A lot of cities have these great parkway systems and then boulevard systems. So that's really what the intent of this is. And then when you combine that with the shared use path along the side of it, it's just another opportunity for providing a different atmosphere or character for people to cross through the city itself.
And I think some of the transformative work that's happening along Lincoln Road right now, and also along Schramm, I think that sort of level of design, I think, is something that would be characteristic of the Ridgeline Boulevard as well. Really kind of the civic corridor for the community. As kind of a secondary mobility enhancement through this area, those dark green lines, the idea would be, as everybody here knows, the south portion of the city, the topography is quite undulating. So there's these existing creeks and wooded draws that you would be, the opportunity most likely won't be there south of the ridgeline to create kind of the dammed up lakes that are the great amenities the city has north of the ridgeline. Just because due to the way the hydraulics work, as the water flows down south to the Platte River, the opportunity really won't be there to create these nice open space amenities in terms of these large man-made lakes. But could we utilize the existing topography and these existing creekways and waterways and actually expand upon those and create what we're terming these greenways? So really the new public open space system is kind of these linear greenways, which we incorporate trails and small park features that could really kind of bisect through the neighborhoods and really set up a framework to connect these various portions of the city. And then the dark green lines would be corresponding parkways. So these would be, again, nice locally well-designed streets that would provide additional local access along these open spaces. And the thinking is, from a traditional development standpoint, as opposed to having these large estate homes back onto these greenways and really create the creeks as more of a private amenity, provide street frontage along the linear green systems and actually utilize these great open space amenities and treat them as public space amenities for everybody to use.
Andy, I'm going to add a few things. So during this whole process, we heard over and over that the lakes were one of Papillion's competitive advantages. These are the reasons why families find it so attractive in this grand open space system. So like Andy said, the ability to do lakes south of the ridgeline wasn't there. So that was the big kind of idea is, okay, instead of that, there's these great draws that these creeks go down. So instead of waterways, we would have these greenways. So it creates this interconnected network that really runs north and south and becomes an amenity in its own right. And then they ultimately tie in with the lakes. So we think the potential is there for Papillion to be one of the few locations around that has this great web of open spaces interspersed with your neighborhoods and development nodes. And it really starts creating this really, really attractive environment that we think just further helps you compete for the families and the best and brightest that you want to attract to the community.
I have a question.
Yep.
I think I heard you say, large, single-family detached would back up to this for the greenways. Did I hear that correctly?
No, so that's kind of a traditional development standpoint. Our goal would be to have street frontage along the greenway, so then it's more of a public open space amenity. You know, you're not limited in terms of public access to it.
Now, would you consider something that, because you're talking about a greenway that ties a lot of parts together, would you consider the fact that using like missing middle housing in that type of setting where you have maybe the cottage setting with small cottages, courtyard, brownstone kind of building, that kind of thing? Would that fit?
Yeah, go ahead.
Definitely. I mean, we're, you know, and as you look at cities developing and trying to attract a diverse workforce, and the people that work in these, you know, as Andy said, kind of the economic development angle that's happening right now in the community is phenomenal. So you've got to provide different types of residential typologies. So the missing middle fits squarely within that. And we show on this next slide that Andy's going to show, it's how those parkways look. We show a single-family detached house fronting onto one of those parkways, but we definitely think that there's plenty of locations along those parkways and elsewhere where you can have the missing middle. So that might be a row of townhomes, that might be cottage homes, that might be, you know, a fourplex, a sixplex, or an eightplex. Our key thing that we wanted to identify here was that we think it's important that you open up those special, unique open spaces and allow the public, and that's not to say that there might be some areas where homes do back up onto them, but for the most part, we think those should be public spaces because that's a community amenity, and that any type of building that fronts onto it should actually front onto it instead of, you know, across the street backing onto it, so you see the rear of the lot from that green
Right.
space.
Okay.
Yeah, but we got a situation kind of going on now that if we pass this one where they're building half apartments that they're calling half homes, you're not gonna have the open space, what you're talking about. They got a plan out on 180th and Harrison, I've been out there 3 times. You're gonna barely be able to park cars there. So if we're real serious about this, we need to pick this up now, because if we allow this to come in, we're not gonna have any park space. We're not gonna have any open space.
Well, but I think what you're saying is that open space would be there regardless. Any building would be beyond that.
Correct. So the idea is that these are these greenways that predominantly run north to south. And on most of them, we're showing a parkway on one side of them. So on one side, you could have homes backing up to them, but on the other side with the parkway, we think that homes should front onto that street, onto the parkway and onto the greenway itself. So it's really getting out in front and designating what those key greenways are, their location, and where those kind of connecting parkways should occur, and then ensuring that the urban form of whatever is built there, you know, actually addresses that space instead of turns its back to it.
So how much is it to actually maintain all this space? I mean, sorry, but you go out and you look at Shram, who has this beautiful open area with our wrought iron fences and our butterflies, and it's being mowed all the time. So are we creating a gigantic mowing maze headache here by doing something like this?
Well, I think that's a great question, because if it's treated as a formal park space, yeah, that would be a costly endeavor. But I think this is one of the key things that I think we wanted to talk about tonight, because this is an important kind of a key aspect of this plan. We want to make sure we had buy-in from you before we finalized it. And so, if you carry over what was in the previous plan, we had already designated preserving these greenways as you know, natural amenities, as areas that should be preserved. But as was mentioned, what typically happens is houses back up to them as close as they can. We keep adopting new regulations to create a bigger and bigger setback. But those kind of natural drainage ways that have trees and green space, they're usually hidden. What this plan proposes is, if we're going to maintain those, and those are the natural places where we like to have trails, those are the tree-lined waterways. Shouldn't that be a public amenity? Shouldn't that be more accessible to the public, or at least visible to the public versus And so the plan to put streets along those to create that accessibility and that visibility, not only to serve a transportation aspect, but a park aspect and just the beauty of our community aspect is a pretty key component of what you've developed. But there is a cost to that. I don't think the intent is that those all be manicured, mowed, linear parkways. They are intended to be more natural, with opportunities to use those for your local parks integrated into them, but not continuous manicured parkways.
Click to the next.
Well, we had a park that was not maintained, and we had to go all the way to Washington to get it turned free back to us so we could mow it, because it became unmanageable, full of bugs and rodents. So where's the line between those?
Yeah, so
Yeah, but that
that'll
was
be part of
different
that.
because that was
Washington
different
DC was
circumstances.
dictating the specific things we had to plant, and that was the weeds.
Or not plant.
And we were gonna go to jail if we didn't plant weeds.
That's-
Washington DC is not telling us what to plant.
So we can control our.
Think of probably more a Walnut Creek natural area as
That makes
opposed
more
to,
sense.
the one where the core was planting weeds.
Yeah, the one you're talking about is a different circumstance because that was, they designated as a wetland.
Right.
And so they called
But
the
what
shots.
doesn't- when you start messing with nature, they can come in different places. That's why I'm asking to be ahead of it, is before, instead of behind it.
Well, in that example, that was a roadside ditch that then got designated a waterway by the Corps. This is actually the opposite, where we're taking our existing waterways and saying, let's build our parks around those. So, at least we know what we're getting into. I will say that again, I think there's some more slides coming. The intent is that those are, natural vegetation, grasses that don't require mowing or maintenance, that type of vegetation.
One thing, the ideal with these greenways that's shown up here is they're native grasses, native stands and trees, and that the maintenance on those is typically, they're mown once a year. You typically mow them in, early to mid-March. And it's about creating habitat corridors and naturalization. And it's really working with that natural kind of system to create this web of open spaces. So we tried to show it on here, and that, as you get down the grade towards the creek area, that as much of it as possible can be naturalized. That's not to say that you might not mow, a mow strip on each side of the trail, or there might even be little clearings that are manicured that become, as Mark had said, the neighborhood parks in key strategic locations. But all in all, the goal is to keep it as natural as possible, so that there's a tie-in to the natural environment from all the different neighborhoods.
Would you treat it the same way that the NRD kind of treats some of the trails now, where you just mow a strip on each side and let everything else be natural?
Exactly, yep.
Yeah, and I just want to bring to your attention too, that this is a fundamental change in how we're pushing development. And, I think there's agreement that parks are important, and this would further define where those parks may ultimately be, or at least the linkages between those parks. There is a cost associated with it. You already brought up the cost of the city for maintenance, but there's a development cost too, because we're actually, looking at requiring a single loaded street in a number of locations. The argument is that it's taking those natural amenities and using them to better, for the betterment of everybody, that everybody has access to those and has a chance to see those and enjoy those versus just those lots that back into it. But to tie into what you said, Steve, from a financial aspect for the developer, you probably will need to have a mix of housing types and some higher density incorporated into the neighborhoods, simply to get the valuation that you need to offset the cost of preserving these natural environments.
One of the other things it does, and I think Councilman Sunday brought it up at the last council meeting, asked about neighborhood parks. Probably the last neighborhood park we added was probably Overland Hills Park, I'm gonna guess. Everything else has been City Park, Walnut Creek, Prairie Queen, the big ones that serve the entire city. And so if you looked at the older part of town,
For the most part, any house could walk to a neighborhood park and then get to a larger city or regional park. And that was a big thing with that Overland Hills development when that came along. We got away from that in the previous comprehensive plan because we got into that discussion of we didn't want little 1 acre parks because that ended up being the trash ground. It was hard. You know, half the people didn't even see it as a park. You had a lot of maintenance issues and a high cost. When we moved that direction, what we ended up losing over the last 6 years was the neighborhood parks. Because now Mark and his folks were steering everybody through our new policies to the larger major regional ones. And now as we look at all the new development that's occurred, and you put it up on a map, we got whole parts of town now without any neighborhood park. And I think what this Greenway discussion now allows is back to, I think Mark mentioned it, you can start identifying strategic areas. Oh yeah, there's 3 acres there. Go ahead and manicure that, make that a neighborhood park, and we can start getting the neighborhood parks integrated back into the system.
But I think this is a more efficient way of doing it.
Yeah.
Than saying, okay, this subdivision has their little park here, 1 acre. This subdivision has their little park. This seems like a more reasonable and more affordable way to do it.
Well, this absolutely keeps us where we're getting more of the 3 acre parks where people more join than the 1 acre parks that people, they don't even realize they're there, and you go by them all day long, there's nobody there, and there's a huge cost to maintain them. So I like this being interlocked together, but still slightly bigger parks.
The other thing that this does is, you know, studies show that it enhances property values. Okay,
South side of the road is maybe north a little bit, so.
all right, look, I was just gonna say the property values, when you back yards up to it, just those properties have increased values because they're the sole ones getting the benefit. But when you open up and allow everyone access to it, studies show that several blocks in, the property values increase. So it's another development tool to increase property values kind of neighborhood wide versus just that veneer that actually touches on that green space. Sorry about that.
This is a really elementary question, but it's more of a check for understanding. When we talk about the Ridgeline Boulevard, it like truly follows the ridgeline?
It's pretty close. We wanted to we obviously had to respect hitting existing streets, those arterial streets at the quarter mile or the half mile sections where we could have a controlled intersection. So we didn't want to hit those streets at weird locations. We wanted to abide by the city's kind of access policy onto into those arterial networks. So.
Yeah, because I'm really trying to visualize this, and that's always kind of in my mind been a sticking point with some of the development. So I think it's a great way to address it from what I know right now.
Yeah. So the image on the screen, the dashed blue line there is the actual ridge line itself, and so our ridge line there, you can see, generally follows that. But again, we're trying to hit those arterial streets at either quarter mile or half mile sections to abide by kind of local traffic control.
Can you show that ridge line, where that ridge line is?
So it's the yellow, it's kind of that yellow, bold line there. It's kind of the green dashes meant to show kind of it's a tree line character.
So the ridge line is the blue dash, and then
the actual ridge line, topographic ridge line is the blue line. The street, the boulevard, is the yellow.
And think about that as a kind of a meandering collector street that tries to follow the ridge line, so the high point, so that from that street you've got your views and your vistas. And I think the intent is that you actually are following the need for a collector street, but this is the path that we want to take because of the advantages of the high point.
I think it's a great idea.
And as Mark and Doug touched on, the greenway system is built into it in and of itself, those small neighborhood parks. But the thinking is, though, we will, at a more regional scale, there won't be a need for those kind of larger regional parks. And so, again, those would fall along those greenways, but those would, again, be associated with some of their more densely developed areas. Again, larger green space attracts greater use, and it makes a lot of sense to have kind of a co-adjacency with some of those denser developed areas.
and the other nice The other nice thing about that is, to get to those regional parks, you can hop in your car and drive to them, but you also have the option of riding your bike, because as Andy said, they're all on those greenways and all along a trail. So from virtually anywhere within that growth zone, you're only a few blocks away from one of those greenways. So you could take the family and you could all ride to one of those parks and not have to take a car. So it has that extra added purpose.
And as you can see on the map there, you can see the colored circles there are meant to be our kind of development nodes, and you'll see the relationship there with the various regional park spaces. So again, kind of that complementary status of those denser developed areas in the green spaces. But again, so these are our development nodes, and we'll get into some of the details of these a little bit later on here tonight. But as you can see, these are really laid out, and again, we wanted to think through where our denser, more impactful development occurs. You'll see the 5 smaller yellow circles, and then the red and blue circle there occur along K Park Road. When we approached this from a regional standpoint, K Park really jumped out to ourselves as having the potential to be a kind of a focal redevelopment corridor. From a regional transit perspective, that was one of the corridors highlighted in the map of regional plans that could potentially have enhanced bus service along there. And so along with that higher level of usage, more multimodal usage along Cape Park, the opportunity will most likely come about where we could have these concentrated developments along Cape Park. So the smaller yellow circles are what we call our neighborhood centers, and those are more oriented towards the neighborhood, retail, and mixed use and commercial areas, really highlighting those missing middle housing typologies. As we move out west, the red circle is our village center, and the idea there, and again, we'll get into some of these details later on, this is our, it's kind of our downtown west. So really repeating the character and kind of the feel of downtown Papillion. We're understanding there's going to be with the future growth, there's going to be quite a few residents that are kind of dispatched from the current downtown. So the idea would be to create kind of a secondary center out west for those more localized users to enjoy. So that's actually set up on 168th and Cape Park Road there. The blue circle is our corporate center, and that's more oriented towards office usage, and as you can see with the frontage onto I-80, more of those interstate oriented uses. The 2 orange dots are our town centers, and those are, as you can see, highlighted on 168th and 72nd, and those intersections with the realigned Platteview Road corridor. So the dash white line there is the currently proposed route of Springfield Platteview as more of the kind of the expressway connection between I-29 and I-80 through Sarpy County. Where that currently intersects I-80, the future interchange is still unknown at this point. We are kind of showing it between 180th and 192nd. But again, the thinking of those two town centers would be at those intersections of 168th and 72nd to really concentrate kind of a mixed-use development node along there. This was a graphic reproduced as kind of an idealized prototypical development node. Really what we wanted to highlight there was the idea of this central neighborhood park green space around which a development occur. Again, the big fear that we heard back from the city in terms of our public outreach was we didn't want big box retail and a sea of concrete parking at every one of these development nodes. The idea would be, can we develop in more of an urban way, a street and open space oriented way where we have frontage onto this neighborhood park space, and our large swaths of surface parking are actually pushed to the rear of the building, so it's redeveloped in more of an urban nature. And as you can see with kind of that diagonal street there on the left side of the screen, the idea would be providing ample connections into adjacent neighborhoods. Again, Doug touched on it. The idea would be we didn't want people to utilize these nodes to have to jump on our arterials and actually drive there to get to these centers. We wanted the adjacent neighborhoods that have a more localized direct route in. So the idea would be, could we utilize access off our Ridgeline Boulevard on these more localized roads and these pocket parks here to provide access for adjacent uses. So we encourage uses by neighbors as opposed to potentially creating any conflict with them.
So Doug and Mark, what's the developers going to complain about in this particular concept?
Depends on the developer.
Financing.
That's correct.
Well, developers must like most people don't like to be told what to do, so you're right. But I think again, as was mentioned, this is a diagram. And I like to think about, can we take the things that we most are most excited about, that we most want to replicate, projects like Prairie Queen, or some of the, the mainstream component of Shadow Lake Town Center, and incorporate those into a neighborhood so that you have your center, you have your shared space and your density, and blend that out into a single family. The challenge with diversity is most of our developers are specialized. And so but I think there's an evolution. I think there's a recognition, and we're seeing it in Papillion, where even our traditional single-family developers are starting to incorporate some higher density components or some commercial components. One, because there's a market for it, it's profitable, and that's good for business. But two, it helps provide that valuation that's so necessary for the developer. And I think from our standpoint, that's good, because more valuation is good for us, and you're spreading those services out, those job opportunities out throughout the community, and not relying so much on your major retail centers, your major employment centers, where everybody has to drive, and you can't live within walking distance of those things. I think that, I guess I would, so that's my answer to that question. I would ask, maybe point out, because I can see it on here, there was a question about the missing middle, and this does incorporate some of that missing middle. If you'll notice here, it's alley loaded, not street loaded, which is something that we've been talking about lately.
Yeah. No, I think Mark hit it. He said you really need to look at this as a diagram. And as we look at it, if you look in the upper right, those are estate homes. So those are large single-family detached homes. To the south of that, along the boulevard, we call those village homes. Those are on a little bit smaller lots. They're a little bit tighter, a little bit more urban. We have on the far left-hand side townhomes. We didn't show cottage homes here. We have just standalone apartment buildings, and we have mixed-use buildings. So there's a whole transect of various residential typologies built into the mix, as well as kind of some fairly standard but brought forward commercial typologies. So, I think going back again, just look at it as a diagram, because this becomes the tool that you're able to work with the developers on. And this might seem a little, into the future. It's really not. We do projects around the country. This is pretty standard stuff, what we're seeing around the country right now. Most developers are beginning to have this expectation that they're being held to these standards. And it's all about helping the city achieve its goals. So one of the things that we liked about this is that the arterial on the top, this is at the intersection of two arterials, Capehart. Andy mentioned that that's a future potential transit line. Well, we call this making that transit ready, because what happens is you build the density, you build the rooftops in a very walkable format, so that by the time you put the transit there, the rooftops are there so people actually use that transit, and it's encouraged to use. So it's always trying to think one step ahead, how you can leverage these opportunities for the benefits of multiple issues that you're trying to address.
I should add too, in terms of thinking about the development community and what are their challenges. I think if we buy into these diagrams and this concept, especially the Cape Park Road corridor, a follow-up action that we're incumbent to make is to then look at our regulations and figure out how to make it easier for the developer to do it. So we can all agree on the plan, but then if the zoning and the rules that we have on development make it very difficult, well, it's going to be very hard for us to achieve our goals. And so that's a follow-up project that we know we're going to have to undertake, is whether it's some sample mixed-use agreements that it's very easy for a developer to tweak and adopt, or even moving towards some different zoning options where it's you can do this by right, or if you want to change it, then you have to get an exception. So yeah, that's another thing that we need to help our developers with.
Mark, when you're talking about zoning options, does that also include, like, instead of being density-based, to be form-based? Is that what you're talking about too? Or is that a little different?
Yeah. You're getting into the weeds.
Okay, never mind.
Form-based code is definitely an option. That's a decision we'll have to make if we want to go that route, if we want to go wholesale into that across the city as a whole different way of regulating development, or whether we want to create some development zones that use that type of zoning. I think there are a number of options. I'm just saying that if we adopt these concepts, I think it's important that we then make it easier for our developers to actually do it
Okay, thank you.
through our regulations.
The next slide we have up there is, we touched on a little bit, is the idea of Cape Art Road and 168th and 72nd Street being these transit-oriented corridors, as Doug mentioned. The idea would be those would be interacting with the development nodes as development comes online. Those corridors really set themselves up to kind of build in demand in terms of rider usage. Again, this is looking at the arterials, and just the only thing to note here is the idea of having those outside lanes be able to handle bus traffic. And so with all that kind of layered analysis, that really helped us shape and helped define our future land use map. This is still kind of in draft format. We're still massaging it a bit, but some things to notice a bit, and it's hard to see, excuse me, without the pointer is, if you can notice those dark kind of maroon patterns with the outlining gold, brown colors, those correspond to those development nodes we're showing along K Park. You see the two along Platteview Road, and then you see kind of the orange color, which is to be that kind of denser residential usage, the missing middle type housing really emphasized at 168th and K Park. They're out west, closer towards I-80. So hopefully those kind of few slides showed you kind of the rationale that we utilize to help develop this future land use map. And working with Mark and Travis, we'll be looking at individual sites that may need to be tweaked a little bit before adopting.
Yeah, and I just want to add one more thing because I'm really excited about this. As we looked at the plan and under HDR's guidance, the Cape Park Road corridor just really, we realized the opportunity there. I mean, there are a few places where you would have employment opportunity at both anchors, the way the Cape Park corridor does. You've got Offutt Air Force Base on the east, and you've got everything happening in the Highway 50 corridor on the west, including we're participating in a health study for the new interchange at I-80 as well. Most likely in the area where we're looking between 180th and 192nd. So you think about the business park opportunity with pulling employment from as far away as Lincoln and beyond. You think about all the employment on the west as well as with the existing employment on the east. Doing mixed use nodes, really building that as a corridor that has the density to support transit. You could live on that corridor and easily commute either through transit or through bicycling or through driving to job centers in Sarpy County, in Papillion. It's emerging as a real job center, not just on the fringe of the metro, but a destination.
So with that as framework, Chapter 3 of the comp plan then moves into kind of the land use policy. And really we wanted to focus tonight on the residential areas. So to begin with, existing demands that Papillion has currently, senior housing, urban housing, starter homes, and market rate multifamily. And I want to emphasize those first three are really focused on kind of the smaller footprint type model homes. And we see, Doug touched on it, across the country, more of a focus on kind of the smaller footprint, smaller lot size, cottage or village styles homes. And what that does is, we do work in a lot of communities where you have the big emphasis on multifamily and then large estate single family home, and there's that missing middle where the term comes from. But really looking at kind of the smaller single family, what that does is it provides diversity in housing stock and actually allows young professionals and young couples looking for that can only really afford a smaller type house opportunity to move into the city. But it also provides some of the retirees and empty nesters that are looking to potentially downsize to have housing stock to move into. But what that does is also, and I know Doug could probably touch on it a little better, is what that does is when they do downsize, that opens up their larger single-family home for those kind of mid-aged families that are looking for larger homes, and really feeds into that continuum of housing within the community itself.
Yeah, I just asked before, Doug, before you say something, the tiny homes, is that concept catching on? I think Omaha is looking at doing some of that. What do you see nationwide? Is that something that's catching on?
Yeah, most communities are doing it, and it all comes down to affordability and trying to create movement within the marketplace. So you're right, Omaha just announced its first big project in North Downtown. But so most communities are, you have to have those in the right place. When they get so small, they're probably more in a very urban type setting, because that's typically where those residents want to be. But yeah, we're definitely seeing that in a lot of different locations. Yeah. And then I was going to feed off of what Andy was saying. The key thing is creating movement within the marketplace, because the one thing that you don't want to do is have a family that moves into a large house, and the kids go off to school, mom and dad are there, one of the parents dies, and you still have one person living in this massive house, and they want to stay in the community, but there's no place for them to go. That's why you provide these different kind of residential typologies, because now you can stay in that community, you can downsize to a cottage home, you're still within the community, but now you've opened up that larger house to another family to come in. So it's all about creating these options and opportunities within the market so that people are constantly churning back and forth as their lifestyle changes. And as we all know, that happens on a regular basis with most families at this point in time. So it gives that flexibility to have options in terms of your housing typology and where you live.
And then just on that second bullet point, I want to look at the last three bullets. Providing that diverse housing stock is one thing, but you also want to leverage your public amenities as well. So, kind of identify around those public open spaces, those green spaces, those greenways, and then also utilize existing topography, geography, and then recreation areas to really enhance the value of those of the new housing areas.
What's an acceptable walking distance? A mile?
I would say, a lot of the studies we do in terms of mixed-use areas, we do the walking radii, and Doug Grant to try it. Probably the quarter mile is.
It depends. It depends on the quality of the walk. If it's a good walk, people will walk a mile or 2 miles. If it's a bad walk, they're not going to walk at all. We typically say if it's a good walk, most people will walk a quarter mile. That equates to a 5-minute walk for virtually anything. But the better the walk becomes, the farther they'll go.
So again, continuing on the residential areas, this is really focused on the existing areas of Papillion. And so really centered around the downtown area, you have your traditional grid system. And so from the comp plan standpoint, the idea would be emphasize on the infill and rehab to kind of preserve that medium density character. Really, and then within that urban center of the community, prevent the envelopment of more suburban-oriented, auto-centric development around downtown. And really that would promote investment within the area, within the district. As we move away from downtown, you can think of Papillion as kind of a concentric rings. We move out to the post-1950 suburban areas, and then, these are less dense. You have more, you kind of lose the grid in areas, but the idea would be it's a mature streetscape and landscaping. Let's preserve that as best we can with either street reconstructions or new streets. We want to prevent the idea of having to widen a lot of these localized streets and lose a lot of those mature landscaping. And then at the outer kind of periphery edges of the city, where we're calling contemporary suburban areas, the idea would be, again, the second bullet point, preserve that section and half section kind of arterial network, but the idea would be encourage development on those kind of open areas. And I think, with the major emphasis on those kind of future growth areas, we looked at in the south part of the city, but started to fill in some of those kind of missing teeth around the edge of Papillion elsewhere. And again, this transitions to the area we really looked at. Now, we touched on a lot of this. Really integrate high-density housing in those mixed-use areas. And then really kind of gradiate out from there, kind of go into the mid-density along those collectors, along the parkways, along the boulevards, is where those missing middle and smaller scale apartments could have, and some of those smaller single-family lots. Utilize the parkway corridors and the Ridgeline Boulevard, and again, preserve that arterial network to kind of create kind of regional layout of that. Commercial areas, again, the emphasis we were given is really drive home the idea of these mixed-use development. You know, we didn't want to have a strictly standalone commercial use at a corner. We want to really utilize that and bring residences to that development center, to provide kind of a mix of uses, a mix of options within that area. And some of those other bullet points are touched on kind of the multimodal access, emphasizing trails and pedestrian and bike access to and from these areas. And then again, diversity in typologies within the mixed use areas we think will be key. And really right sizing those development centers to their localized context. The mixed use office, office really only makes sense in certain areas of the city. I know we identified that in the area between Cornhusker and kind of the west Papillion corridor along kind of the northwest portion of the city there, and really that's going to be driven by the transportation network we kind of highlighted earlier. Downtown Papillion, and we're going to touch on downtown. Downtown has its own section within the comp plan. The idea would be to create kind of Suffolk County's version of the old Market, Dundee, or Benson, really these active, young, energetic downtowns. But again, as Doug and Mark touched on, really the idea of preserving that traditional charming feel that the downtown area already has. Let it stand on its own, but attract the same kind of uses as those areas within Omaha. And industrial, obviously more of the western portions of the community is where that'll be concentrated closer to I-80 and the Highway 50 corridors. Really looking at areas that, we probably don't have the frontage along 80, so look at areas that don't have the interstate frontage or the railroad access, and really looking at west of 114th Street, north in that Cornhusker area. So here's where we kind of touch on each of the development node types. The corporate center node, and I know Travis helped a lot with a lot of this technical information in these as well. So we gave you kind of a rough size, and that's plus or minus 200 acres. Major employment center regionally, Mark touched on it, the idea of being able to bring in employees, both from Omaha and Lincoln potentially to work here. The potential to have either surface or structured parking, I think would be open within the development itself. The idea of kind of capping the heights of these buildings, again, right-sizing the developments, that makes a lot of sense along that corridor. But really utilize the idea of this frontage onto I-80 to bring in kind of those more corporate, more professional service office uses in this area. I guess I should touch on really the idea would be in the red dot there, the village center, and some of the more dense residential there. The idea would be, could we provide housing opportunities for employees of that corporate center within Papillion itself along the 168th Street corridor. The neighborhood centers, jumping to kind of the smaller development nodes. The smallest of the development nodes we're proposing, those are roughly 20 acres in size, and those are more geared towards the neighborhood service retail that really kind of fit the more residential context that we're within. We would not want big box and major retail components in that. These are kind of your everyday needs for localized users around that area. And again, I think this is where we can emphasize the idea of multifamily and missing middle housing technology.
And what we're trying to do here is right size some of these retail areas, because retail is in such flux right now that there's a lot of uncertainty about where it's going. But we do know that for the most part, a lot of it's being limited. There are some growth areas in it because people still like to look and feel in touch. So what this really begins to set up is a reduced framework. So you're really focusing it, key strategic points to get the biggest bang for your buck, instead of kind of lining a big long corridor, and then over time it becomes marginal, and then all of a sudden it hops to the next corridor and the next corridor. So it's being incredibly smart with where you're allowing this, so that you maintain the viability of that long term to the benefit of the community.
And again, that was informed during our charrette a couple years ago, was feedback, from the existing neighbors. They didn't want a strip center at every corner along one of these major corridors. So again, as Doug mentioned, let's concentrate at these key intersections and really build off from there. The town center nodes I touched on, those are more oriented towards the future extension of Platteview Road as the connection between I-29 and I-80. These are roughly plus or minus 80 acres in size. We incorporate grocery stores and some of the drive-in restaurants, some office usage. And so these are more oriented towards localized users, but also thinking about Platteview Road as more of an expressway. So we might have some regional, more interstate type users utilizing as well. So, apply some uses that would be more oriented to those visitors. And then finally, as I mentioned, the Village Center mixed-use node, that's really the idea of bringing a second downtown for the western portion of the community. This would be 100 acres in size. This is the largest of mixed-use nodes. And again, we're looking at medium, high-density residential, really heavy mixed use. And then this would be kind of a blend of auto-oriented businesses, and then some of the more, and this, thinking about a second downtown, the incorporation of more cultural, civic facilities makes a lot of sense in this node. So moving away from kind of the land use policy, we then go into community facilities, services, and utilities. And from a comp plan standpoint, the goal here, and really the focus is kind of an inventory of existing facilities, documenting locations, age of facilities, and whatnot. So our team, we went through, and you can kind of see listed up on screen there what we kind of surveyed. And then we actually interviewed officials with these various agencies to kind of get their feedback on the facilities themselves. But we focused on utilities, infrastructure, the public facilities, and then also educational, looking at schools, up from high school all the way down to elementary schools.
I think an important thing to note in the comprehensive plan as we grow south is on educational. We cross into a new school district, and the legislature's frozen that boundary. So we will be one city with two school districts, and we'll have to recognize that and work with both districts. So that would be the Springfield Platteview School District will be in their jurisdiction for a major part of this. And then the other thing is Papillion Vista has acquired the land for the third high school already. And Springfield Platteview already has an elementary school in our jurisdiction. So as you build the inventory, we got to look at that other district.
Sure. So again, in a little more detail, in terms of community facilities, these are the services and the buildings we highlighted and document within the comp plan itself. And then along with that kind of inventory data, we actually provide maps within it. It's just a map of the city facilities as they are located there. And then kind of dovetailing off what the mayor just mentioned, here's a map of the school district boundaries, and that kind of highlights within our ETJ, the Springfield, Platteview, and the Papillion Vista kind of dual school districts there.
Before you do the final of this, you might want to go back and change. You got the senior center on Limerick Road. It's now part of the landing. It's called 55 plus.
I got
moved, you're in.
Okay, thank you. This is another opportunity to mention this is still a draft version, so we appreciate that. Next chapter is the energy element. And in terms of this chapter, we are carrying over the majority of the section from the 2012 plan. The understanding there would be this specific chapter would be studied as a separate work effort after this plan is adopted. So that second bullet point kind of highlights that. So that's why you can kind of see the Papillion energy profile there is from 2010. So it's a little outdated information, but the understanding is it'll be a separate work effort to update that portion of the comp plan.
So without going into the details of some of this outdated data, I'll just flip through the slides here. Chapter 6, the Parks and Open Space section. Again, like the community facilities, this will be mainly focused on the types of park and overall inventory of the various types. Again, we know the Parks Master Plan is a study that's currently ongoing. So obviously, once, whatever is documented in that study, we'll need to incorporate and sync this up with what we're showing in ours in this section. But basically, as I mentioned, we're looking at the typologies of parks, our neighborhood parks, the community and regional parks, and the special use parks will be documented and again located via map. Again, we also incorporate, we'll highlight the new parks and also focus on the trail network. This is a map we have that we're looking at the bike and trail network, and as you can see there, we have the existing, we have future, and then we are showing the Ridgeline Boulevard again as that civic corridor that would incorporate a side use path along that. So that would be a key east-west spine for the city's overall regional network. Chapter 7, we get into housing. And I know a lot of the data we utilize here is we utilize the recently completed Sarpy County study, which helped inform some of the info that helped build our data here. Some of the bullet points there on the screen, half the housing has been built within the last 30 years. Papillion is looking at just under 70% of owner occupancy rate, and the median home value is $167,000. And then on the right there, we're showing some graphic of age of housing stock, and then also the composition of renter versus owner occupied. So future housing needs, and we've emphasized this throughout our discussions tonight, but the idea of promoting diversity in your housing stock will be very important. Again, if we adopt this kind of node development pattern as we kind of grade out from that, the idea of right-sizing the housing to the demand based on the development pattern will be key. So what's really jumped out to us, and what the city, Mark and Travis really kind of dictated to us, was really focused on the opportunity of incorporating the missing middle housing typology within that. I think everybody can see the success that is happening out in Prairie Queen, and I think the opportunity is we can repeat that framework elsewhere throughout the community. So we just love that top graphic there. We use that all the time within our design standards. But you can kind of see even within the housing, the missing middle housing typology, it's a whole broad spectrum of types of these structures that could be incorporated to really right size to the individual development. And really, again, we emphasized it earlier, but this really fills the gap between what you see now, those single family units, and the multifamily apartment buildings.
And I think one thing to point out is that second bullet point, 8 of 10 households being childless. I mean, think of that. Think of the houses you see driving through the community and realizing that 8 of 10 of those do not have kids at home. And those are probably 4-bedroom, 3-car garage homes. So that really, I think, begins to point out the necessity of missing middle housing, because so many people don't have those large families. So, how do you begin providing for those different wants, needs, and desires in terms of housing?
Mark, one of the challenges I think we're going to have, though, as we think about missing middle, I think we'll all just look at Prairie Queen as kind of the ideal model of how it's done. But that is a multi-family model, and our code was really challenged to make that occur. And if we want to take that and move it into a owner-occupied model, where maybe I can buy a duplex, live in one, and get some income off the other side, I don't think we could pull off today a Prairie Queen in an owner-occupied model. But we should be able to. So one of the ramifications of this is we've got to work our own codes, and that's got a lot of ramifications, fire code and everything else, to enable that type of thing where appropriate.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to where we're at with the comprehensive plan. It's easy to say, well, we haven't, fully updated it since 2005, but there's been amendments made and additions made constantly since then. And now we're looking at housing, and we're going to have some some housing recommendations in this plan, but we also know that we have a follow-up effort. We're going to have a meeting with council and planning commission with Dan Perolik to talk about missing middle. The intent there is to follow up with the development community and understand better their interests. And then the next step, again, as I mentioned before, kind of with those mixed-use nodes, is think about our regulations and how do we make it easier and more predictable for developers to do projects like Craigly, and we're do a variation of that. If we make it easy to do what we want, hopefully we're a much better chance of getting it versus making a developer jump through a bunch of hoops.
A great point, and that segues right into the next slide. I think it'll be important as we finalize the comp plan, to point out some of the efforts that the city will be able to encourage the developers through these kind of policies and these initiatives, encourage some of this kind of specialty type housing.
I agree with Mark, because this is an important part of what we need. We have way too many apartments in my mind, and we're gonna probably still be having apartments come our way. We need these houses more than we need apartments. This, to me, is something that we've probably been missing for a long time. And maybe we need to, maybe you're gonna have to work a little overtime. But no, seriously, this is what I would like to see Papillion start trending towards, instead of either $1 million houses or apartments. That's basically all we're getting, and we need this bad, so.
Well, I think you can look at that as well in terms of competitive advantage. If Papillion's able to provide this, all of a sudden you begin out-competing all the other competition within the region. So there's some definite plus upside to that as well.
Besides having some competitive edge, you're increasing the variety of your housing inventory. And the third thing I think you also are preserving is something everybody in here tonight, I think, considers important, and is you really kind of reinforce that community feel. When you start doing nodes of mixed type housing and middle missing housing, you increase that feeling of community, belonging to the community.
And well-designed missing middle.
Yeah.
That is designed to do what you're saying, absolutely can do that. I think the challenge for us is being able to, agree, what does accomplish that, and then how do we make that happen, but not get, the other types, the types that do just the opposite, that take away from that feeling of community and neighborhood.
Yeah,
And maybe you can speak to that.
Yeah, because the risk you run into a little bit is you have a developer that sees that trend coming, and they say, oh, this section's middle missing housing. When it isn't, what that is taking an apartment complex, a 3-story traditional, and chopping it into 3 sections and calling it middle missing housing. And that's what happens, I think Gene and I've talked about, that we have to watch out for.
As soon as he said 180, then Harrison, my light went on in my head. I knew exactly what he was talking about.
That was just reflection off your head.
That could be too. I might not have had my hat on.
Well, and back to the community, design, as we've all said, is so important. And I'm glad to hear that Dan Prolik's going to be here, because, he gets it unlike no other. He's phenomenal with it. But it's really about, how do you design that? And it's not about garages in front. That says it's a house for a car. It's about garages in back, off of alleys. It's creating that communal open space. It's creating those opportunities we call chance encounters. So when you walk outside your door, you actually meet and talk to your neighbors and get to know them. So all those things Dan knows really well, and I'll be real curious to hear how that session goes, because most of you guys I think know him. He's a whiz at it, and if he can provide some good guidance on it, I think you guys will be well on your path.
Before we go any further, how do we create incentive for developers to create things like this? Is that what we're doing when we put this out? We say, hey, these are the things we want, because so many times they bring developments, at least to the planning commission, and I look, well, it fits with adjacent land uses, and it seems like it's an appropriate use of the land. Do I like the development? Not really. I'm tired of seeing another single-family housing for $400,000 in our community, so that pretty soon you can't have any teachers living in Papillion or any fire policemen, no one else. But yet, they say, well, the market dictates what the price for these homes are going to be. That's a frustration thing. I don't really know. How do we get things like that cute little cottage right there, How do we get things like that to come into our city?
Part of it is, then I'll let Mark fill in, part of it is this exercise. One, we as the appointed elected officials need to be able to enable Mark to articulate, and that is the initial purpose of the comprehensive plan. What is our vision combined for Papillion? And so this is the first step. Once we can get it articulated here, and that other conversation we're going to have with Dan about missing middle feeds directly into this, because we got to be able to articulate this in Papillion's context. But once we can get it into the comprehensive plan, now the concept is there. Mark, from a regulatory perspective, can start enabling it, negotiating it. The next step, though, is then him figuring out, how do I take policy, get it into ordinance so I can negotiate. So once we adopt this, they'll have the hard work then to figure out within our regulations what we need to refine to support this.
Yep.
At that point in time, we've got policy and regulations that the development community knows and understands and Mark can negotiate against. Right now, we're missing this in the conversation, so we get kind of what we get. Is there a better way to say that, Mark?
Well, it's a great question, and it's the $1 million question. How do we get development? Because developers have a really hard job. They're taking on all this risk. They're taking on huge debt, and so it's much easier for them to build and sell and get financing for known successful projects. And so that's why you see a continuation of single-family houses or large apartment projects, because that's been successful in the past. Banks will lend on it. Developers know how to build it. They know how to sell it. So we're asking to do something different. So one, we need to be clear so that it's not a moving target. We will embrace this new type of housing, this new design. We're going to set some parameters up, but this is what we want within these parameters. But again, we talked about it a couple times already. The next step is, how do we make it easy? Because there are incentives, and we've tried density bonuses and things like that. And density bonuses don't work very well in the Midwest, because land is getting a lot more expensive than it used to be, but it's still much easier to come by and cheaper than maybe on the coast. But if it's easy, if the developer knows they can get the project approved within a reasonable amount of time, and that they can predict that if they come in with a certain design, they'll get that approval. That's a big first step. I think there's agreement in the room that Prairie Queen has turned out to be a great project. And when we saw the design for that, we loved it. Then we had to scratch our heads and figure out, how do we ever approve that and permit that? We learned a lot of hard lessons. I think we tried to make it as easy as we could, and yet there were countless frustrations along the way for the developer, because we were all learning how to do it. So that's where, again, I think we have a responsibility as a city. If we're going to articulate what we want, then that next step again is, now we got to figure out how to make it easy for developers so that we're more likely to get it.
Well, I think you make it easy for developers, Mark, too. I think that coincides with what we get from developers, like you were talking about, is how many times have we heard, why are you building multifamily again? That's the only way the numbers work. If we would do this type of housing and show that there's a speed to getting it through and getting it approved, and that increases their financial potential, that's how I think we also move to a little different model, don't you think?
Yeah, and I think we're fortunate to have some great examples already in our community, like Brooklyn, where we can show you get great design, you get a great sense of community and neighborhood, you get those chance encounters. And oh, by the way, it's cheaper to build and has higher density than a traditional multifamily project. That's the lesson to the development community is, oh, you can do it better, you can do it nicer, and it can be more financially viable. So without that example, it's much harder to get that.
That's a great discussion. Chapter 8, the downtown plan. And like the energy element, what we're showing in the comp plan is going to go in front of Commission and Council will be largely carried over from the 2012 version, with the understanding again that as a separate work effort, that plan will be updated in and of itself. But within the comp plan, we again want to emphasize kind of the major tenets of the downtown plan itself, and really focus on the physical transportation and the market environment, and really, again, looking at what downtown could be, and actually, again, now that we're 8 years past the original plan, really building off of what has occurred and what really is an asset to the community within downtown. The emphasis obviously would be on public space. First Avenue Plaza is a great public space there in downtown. Linkages, the idea of making an easy and safe transportation network throughout downtown. Transportation and parking, we want to make sure that those are provided to those downtown businesses for their users and their customers, so it's an easy retail environment for them. And again, really emphasizing future development, building off the existing framework that is there in downtown. Now, Chapter 9 focuses on the city's transportation network. And this now, we're kind of moving out more to the larger city scale focus. The idea would be, and we touched on this on some of those illustrative sections we had in the future growth areas, but the idea of building off of the aesthetic qualities of some of these design standards. The idea would be move away from the undesirable effects and you really treat these as kind of the primary open space corridors for the community. Again, don't focus on a single mode. We want to create kind of a multimodal emphasis throughout the city. And again, think about the streets as the #1 public space within a city. Think about them as kind of their role in the urban design and the character, creating these streets with these great streetscape amenity areas to, for the longest time, cities kind of turned their back on streets and just, did the bare minimum, moved the cars to and from these individual development sites. But to really utilize these corridors as kind of the connective tissue for the city to really build off some of their community assets from there. And some of the expectations build off those valuable lessons learned from past plans. Convenient and smooth functioning network. The emphasis of secondary collectors, and again, that Ridgeline Boulevard as kind of these secondary people and vehicle moving corridors that really lessen the usage of those arterial network, And again, an emphasis on those ped and bike network. Again, emphasizing the idea of an active and healthy community, and also building out the idea of utilizing those public greenways as public open space. The bicycle network, which we touch on a bit in the park plan, but again, we're re-emphasizing the transportation network and how that, and the role they play within the multimodal intention of the comp plan itself. We'll show you the multi-use trails, and those shows you kind of the various typologies of the trails. We go from regional to recreational to the local. But then, is there a different way to also build additional connections for bicyclists? Side paths are those off-street corridors that parallel streets. Complete streets, can we provide on-street facilities such as bike lanes and protected cycle tracks that actually bring the bring the riders onto the streets with the vehicles themselves.
Mark, I just want to be careful that when we talk complete streets, we don't make, follow a Bellevue model. They adopted a formal complete streets program, and then they tried to retrofit into their existing system, and they made the biggest mess I think you'd ever see. And I think they destroyed their transportation by adopting and doing what they did, so we want to be careful when we retrofit that we don't create an illogical system.
Yeah, and the key to not doing that is good communication, so that we're not adopting things without other departments and without elected officials knowing what's being adopted. And then too, just being deliberate. You know, we know that, and this is a discussion that happens in all the time. There's a complete streets program, or there's a project that proposes maybe a road diet, and there's a false expectation that we're going to retrofit every street in the city, and there simply isn't enough money in the world to do that. You know, I would go back to the intent of the plan is, how do we regulate new development? How do we guide and steer a new development plan? So that you make a great point, and that is, you know, we need to make plans and be able to provide good guidance to the development community on what the expectations are. And I think if I understand you right, you're saying we need to be cautious to not create a false expectation that would cause a retrofit. If we are deliberately or specifically saying we need to fix something that's already been built, call that out in the plan separately and not lump it in with everything else.
But I got a question on that though, but if we got a good trail system, which we've got a pretty good one, it could get a little better. What do we need bikes on the street for if the trails take us everywhere we gotta go anyway?
I'm glad you asked. And this is something that comes up a lot with building a bicycle network. It's the idea, is bicycling for recreation or is it for transportation? And the answer is both. People use bicycles in many different ways, just like people use cars in many different ways. You know, if you have a vehicle designed to go completely off-road, you still may use it for transportation, but you also use it maybe for some fun on the weekends. The same can be true for a bicycle. You can ride it to work or to the store, but also ride it for entertainment or for exercise. And so, especially in today's age where every other driver is looking at their cell phone while they're driving, it is actually, I think, more important to have an off-street bicycle network, even for transportation, not just for entertainment. But you can't get everywhere on a trail. You have to ride on the street to get to the places that you're going to. So building a diversified network where you have options, where you can ride on the trail, but in places where there isn't a trail available or it doesn't take you to the place you need to go, you should be able to ride on the street. There should be a way to do that relatively safely. There should be diversity in our road networks. So you have an option to take a local street maybe instead of the arterial street. But that means having good local street connectivity from neighborhood to neighborhood so that you have that option. You know, and we do need to be conscious of the differences in service. A trail is great for bicycle transportation and for recreation. It's also accessible to multiple users. You can walk your dog, you can push a baby carriage, you can go for walks or for a run or ride your bike. Where you have to be cautious is what kind of conflict are you creating? You know, the trail around Walnut Creek, the trail around Prairie Queen are awesome trails that get used tremendously. But if you want to ride your bicycle at 20 miles an hour, you've got no business being on those trails. That's not the place to do that. You should either be on the street or on a regional trail where there aren't as many walkers or other slower users. And then the bike lanes, I think, are something that often get misunderstood. Their focus really is using bicycle for transportation. They don't serve the same purpose as a trail because that's not a place where people walk or run or push a stroller or walk their dog or those types of things. It really is strictly bicycle transportation. And they have a place, they have an important place, but they have to be balanced with other types of networks that provide service to multiple users.
And very similar to bike lanes, that last plane cycle track, the image in the lower right-hand corner is from River's Edge in Council Bluffs. It's a development we helped design. We designed the cycle track there along the main River's Edge Parkway. And in addition to providing another mode of transportation to bring users into this mixed-use development, what it did is it actually activates the streetscape itself. At the terminus of the cycle track is a Piazza Plaza type space that opens up onto the regional Hannafin Park space in the riverfront. So it's also, besides bringing in additional users, it can also be a means of activating the streetscape itself, but also as a tool to encourage potentially that denser development within the urban framework. Simultaneously to some of the improvements to the bicycle network, the pedestrian policy, again, the main activity here is for both localized and regional traffic to commute destinations, schools, parks, and these new mixed-use development areas to provide, really emphasize a safe network for pedestrians. We don't want pedestrians to get left behind, as they have been recently with more of the auto-centric development. So three main points of concentration. There's a removal of barriers, bridges over drainage ways, providing signals, signalized controlled crossings across busy streets. And then actually, when to get off streets, provide safe, well-lit, dedicated pathways, whether they be trails or side paths along streets or just simple sidewalks through newly developed neighborhoods. And then again, from the initiative policy standpoint, financing some of these improvements into these individual development projects. Access control was touched on a little bit earlier, but the idea of limiting, the city has adopted these spacing requirements for intersections along the arterial network. So your lighted, signal-controlled intersections would occur at the half and quarter mile sections, and then at every eighth of the mile, there would provide opportunity for potential for right in, right out only, onto the arterials. And that again is just another control measure to help one, define what that development looks like at those nodes, but also to encourage different users with different routes to and from these major destinations. But I guess the last point is the idea would be fulfilling access control requirements would sync up with the city of Omaha's and the other communities within the region to provide some continuity amongst the communities.
Yeah, I might touch on that just very briefly. We really don't have an access control policy in Papillion. We rely heavily on the model that Omaha has created. Circuit County has an access control policy that I think is modeled after Omaha's. I think there's value in being consistent, but if we wanted to be different, this would be the time to say so. So I don't know if there are any thoughts on that.
You want me to jump in?
That was a veiled directed to you.
I'm a strong believer in this. There's no question about it. And so I would think that if Omaha and Sarpy County are using energy consistent, try to consider using this model that's been used in the Omaha area for many, many years. Perfect. No, it's not. Did not develop that.
And again, to kind of cap off the section of a road classification map, this is still ongoing in terms of refinement. Chapter 10, the annexation policy. And so this will be again a continuation of the policy that was adopted in 2012. And basically some of the bullet points there would be kind of the focus of that. Each area that's under consideration for annexation would be again undergoing a positive would warrant a positive cost-benefit analysis. In terms of SIDs, that would require the SID analysis report, which looks at those various factors that are listed under there. And then working with Travis and Mark in the planning department, the idea would be we wanted to create a map, a network of these outlying areas that could be incorporated into the city potentially along a phased approach, with the understanding of geographically speaking, we'd probably work north to south in terms of phasing in. Just obviously it makes sense from an adjacency and standpoint in terms of utilities and whatnot. But what we wanted to do is we wanted to create a map diagram showing that. So basically what this shows is, as I touched on, you can kind of see the missing teeth are kind of the lighter gray colors, and that would be a potential for an early phase area to be annexed within the city. And the understanding would be as the utility network grows and some of the South Sarpy County aspects come online, the idea would be as more and more areas open to the south would make more and more sense to be brought in probably at a later point in those areas further to the north, on the north side of the ridge line. Travis, Mark, I don't know if you want to add anything else.
Yeah, I think that the annexation phasing and the work that, and I give Travis all the credit on our end, is really based on what we do annually as a city and analyzing SIDs and really thinking about what is ready to be annexed. And so this wasn't a guessing game of what we think might be the next phase of annexation. It started with looking, taking the data from our annual SID analysis and plugging that into the map, looking at real land use patterns and land uses, and then working across what we thought was appropriate phasing. So obviously, the further out you get, the more guessing you're doing. But those, I think this represents creates a real picture of how our annexation will likely occur over the next several years.
Chapter 11, goals and implementation. And this will be within the comp plan, kind of our summary chapter. So within each of the preceding chapters, we'll include goals and objectives under each of those categories. And so basically, chapter 11 here is going to be kind of a summary, a tabulated summarization of those different goals. And basically, the idea would be within each of those goals, we'd assign a type, whether it would be a physical project, a policy, whatnot, and then we'd assign kind of a rough time frame for those. So we'd go all the way from short-term, ongoing, and then on to short, medium, and long-term projects to really, again, play into the idea it's kind of this phased approach for some of these overall goals and objectives within the comp plan itself. And chapter 12 is getting into with appendices, and I just have the ones we have outlined currently that'll be included in the plan as the appendix. And again, these will be tied to either on established, adopted plans and initiatives that impact what we're showing in the comp plan, but were kind of standalone documents that could be referenced as you go through the comp plan, but didn't necessitate incorporation within the document itself. So.
Hey, Andy, I wanted to ask, since we were on implementation, and it was, I thought that was the right place to ask the question, even though it's related to annexation. So the mapping that's shown is a good prediction, I think, based on existing policy and analysis. One philosophical question, and I don't know that that's something that we can get a definitive answer tonight, but it's something I'd really welcome an opinion on. Is, as we regulate development, especially since most of our residential development, even some of our commercial, is in the form of SIDs, would we rather minimize the debt of those SIDs as much as possible in order to speed up annexation? Or is it better to allow a higher debt and delay annexation in exchange for having that development be able to finance some more of the amenities that we want? And if so, what are the amenities that we should be pushing for to, we willing to exchange, delaying annexation in exchange for which amenities. Any thoughts on
At a high level, we're gonna have to find that balance. I think instead of just saying it's a 4% debt ratio, I think we might end up with a range. And if a developer just, when I'm making this up, if a developer just wants to bring a regular development and they're not doing anything to promote our goals, kind of the comment that was made of each development looks the same. Well, that development's probably gonna be held to a high standard of a low debt ratio. Why should we allow more debt when you're not supporting our goal? But at the same time, you need to contribute towards our goals. So we may keep you at a 4% and charge you some fees. On the flip side, if there's a development that's coming out and hitting it out of the park and meeting all of our goals, well, that's probably costing them to do that. And to enable that, we may have to allow a higher debt ratio to get to our goal, knowing that that may put off annexation. But the issue then is knowing what's the upper limit of that threshold for debt. Because if we then get above that acceptable threshold, we could end up with a Westmont situation. You can never annex it, and by the time you can, the infrastructure's gone. So we go to annex it, we gotta replace the infrastructure, which we can't afford to do. So I think our policy's gonna have to deal with a range, and how they support our goals determines where we end up in that range.
And that gets back to the earlier question about incentives. Maybe this is one of the incentives where, if we can clearly articulate our goals and the development is, as you say, working to achieve those goals, maybe that's when we allow a higher GO debt ratio as one of the incentives.
So I think one of the things we've done, and this has been a number of years back, we essentially established what the minimum levy that the SID is to charge, which is no question about it. Allow them to pay that off a lot sooner. I think it's positive for us to maybe stay on top of that, because obviously I think it was set at 88 cents, if I'm not mistaken, or 80 cents, whatever it was, which is what Omaha's been doing for years. I think even the fiscal agents say today is that they're looking at, 90 cents in order to be able to pay these things off? So that's something else I think that we need to stay on top of from the perspective is that do we continue at 88 cents or do we consider, moving it similar to what the fiscal agents are requiring the developers to do? We want them to get, I think, my opinion is get paid off as quickly as possible.
Yep.
Because then it makes it easier for us to be able to, and it doesn't seem that the high debt levy, maybe it's because of the fact that what's the median household income, and the people can afford to pay.
One of the things that we've explored, because so many developers, or I should say the representatives have said, is that speed is so much more important than that matchable GO debt ratio. But speed is a hard thing to regulate, and it's a hard thing to predict. And outside of things that are beyond anybody's control, like the economy, such as a recession or COVID-19, things that you can't predict. I have been told that there can be some predictability in when a project or when an SID could be annexed. They could, instead of saying, give me 5% GO debt ratio, reverse it, and we should be able to say, if this works out as planned, can you be annexed in a specified amount of time? Work backwards.
We're sending this home.
Apparently we've run long. So that's something we could ask for your benefit, is included in the data that the developer provides is a prediction of when it would be ready for annexation. And then you can decide, well, based on what I see, 12 years seems reasonable, or maybe 20 years is reasonable because of some of the components of development. If those are things that you as a council would find helpful, we can start working towards asking developers for that information.
Well, and a mixed-use development, obviously, I would think is going to pay off some standalone residential subdivision because we have higher density
we have to stay aware that we are not ever under a set date that we have to annex something. And so the policy of making sure that those in the new area are paying their fair share and it doesn't ride over onto our current people has to stay in place. Now, we in no way should ever compromise that because we want to make sure that those that are already in the city are treated equally fairly.
Mark, you got anything else, or you got to wrap up?
Those are all the slides. I think the lights were tied to our PowerPoint, so they were out of slides.
That's pretty good, Andy.
I think one of the things we just want to make sure of is sanity check is it being thought about right? And again, if you roll back a year and a half ago when this started originally, there were a lot of listening sessions, there were group sessions, public coming out, we had some meetings here. So it's not the first time we've had input. It was just a long time ago, but this is kind of the assimilation of everything they've heard, and they're starting to wrap it up. So if there's concerns, issues, conversations we need to be having before they wrap it up, this would be the time to throw those items out.
I came in a little late, so maybe I missed it, but is this Ridgeline Boulevard concept, is that also extending all the way to Retina? Is that something they're looking at as well?
Not that I'm aware of. And the
Ridgeline
natural barrier,
does extend
and the
to-
natural barrier would be the interstate, because as you follow through our jurisdiction, you'll hit the interstate.
Okay, so you don't, that Ridgeline does not continue?
The ridge line goes over, but not the boulevard system.
Oh,
That's a
I see.
concept that came out of our sections and in our jurisdiction.
Okay, very good,
Yep.
thanks.
Just, you asked for a wrap up, and I'm not at all trying to limit any comments or questions. But the appendices, these are the sections that we're not necessarily amending with this effort, but we know that they will be separate additions to the plan, and some of those need to be updated as a separate effort. You have a copy of you've seen the PowerPoint presentation, you have a copy of the draft. This meeting was really important to us to get some direction, get, as you mentioned, Mayor, sanity check on the main components of the plan. Now we're, with your blessing, we're ready to fill in the blanks, to add the narrative that further describes the key components of the plan. So that's where we're at right now.
And then the process, once you fill in the gaps based on what you've heard, and you've got what you think is the final version, then it goes through the normal process of going to the planning commission for their hearings and their input and their recommendations, and then the council for wrapping up and adoption, right?
That's exactly right. So the next step is for us to now finish putting the meat on the bone, finalizing the plan, and then there'd be a public hearing at planning commission and followed by a public hearing at council where you would make the final decision. And that's not to say we can't continue to edit and tweak as we go through that process, but our next step is to create a final draft for adoption.
Probably the biggest change that I see in it is, besides validating the concept of the green ribbons and the boulevard, which that came out of the early sessions, I think the big part is this whole housing type and affordability conversation in the missing middle. And we've got another session specifically on that topic. If you're not familiar with, we keep mentioning missing middle and a guy by the name of Dan. If you're not familiar with that, Dan is probably the guy in the nation, I think, that articulated this missing middle concept. He owns a design company in San Diego called Opticos, but he's from Columbus, Nebraska. And Prairie Queen, the development at 132nd Lincoln that we all tout, that was his design. And so Jerry Reimers, the local developer, hired Opticos, and Jerry basically, with a few tweaks, implemented his design. And the fact and the tweaks that Jerry made, I think he now says he shouldn't have tweaked them, he should have stayed with Dan's design. We were just talking about that earlier. So again, some good learnings. And Dan has written a book called Missing Middle that was just published. Council got a copy of it. And he actually talks about in the book, I think he devotes 7 pages to Papillion in his nationwide book. and talks about Prairie Queen as being one of the first new missing middle projects in the nation. And Jerry Reimers has already had, I think, 5 or 6 people, developers around the nation, traveling to Papillion to understand how to do development. So I don't think we even appreciate the gym we've got here to learn from. But that Dan is who we're going to have on the call. Originally, we wanted to do a Zoom session so we could all be interacting on Zoom. We got legal advice that we can't do that because of the Open Meetings Act. The governor hasn't allowed remote meetings. So we do physically have to be together. And now we're trying to figure out logistically with Dan. He can't travel because of COVID. So can he be up on the screen and can we have a good interaction or not? So we'll need a good facilitator, probably Mark. Or worst case, we may do 2 sessions with Dan so it's not an open meetings. Then we can go back to Zoom. But the problem there is we don't get the benefit of everybody having the dialogue. So we're figuring that out right now. But the importance of that discussion to this document is real important. So we want to do that sooner than later. So be watching for that. Anything else? I think if there's nothing else, I think the next thing was a motion for the Planning Commission to adjourn because the City Council has a closed session, but we don't have a quorum of the Planning Commission, so they can't take a motion, so they can just leave, right?
I think they can still conduct regular business to adjourn.
Say that again?
They can still take a vote just to adjourn with regular
Okay.
business.
Well, the City Council could take a motion for the Planning Commission to adjourn.
Hey, it's Phil Saddleton, isn't he on the planning commission tonight?
I guess maybe for a formality, on the City Council side, is there a motion for the Planning Commission to adjourn?
Motion.
Motion by Jaworski.
Second.
Second by Klug. Vote.
Aye.
All in? Aye.
Aye.
That was unanimous. Motion passes.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody. We are going to have a closed session. So is there a motion to go into closed session to protect the public interest to discuss land negotiations?
Motion.
Motion by Klug, second by Ingberg.
We take a 5-minute break.
We'll take the 5, we can do that. Any proponents? Opponents? Council discussion? Please vote.
Aye.
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 Motion passes. I'll state for the record, the purpose of the closed session is only to discuss land negotiations. It will include the mayor, the city council, city administrator, deputy city administrator, assistant city attorney, planning director, and city clerk. So if you're not one of those, you are excused after a 5-minute break.